For the first time in decades, the sky above Ouagadougou was silent. No engines roared, no lights flickered, no voices echoed through the air. The runway stood empty beneath a pale red dawn. Only the wind moved, brushing against the windows of a sleeping control tower. Across Europe, newsrooms erupted. Burkina Faso closes its airspace. Some called it isolation, others called it warning. But inside the country, among the dust and the quiet, people began whispering the same words. Something is coming. 72 hours later, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television. He didn't wear a suit. He wore his uniform, stained with the sand of the Sahel. Behind him stretched a horizon of endless desert, a scene not of weakness, but of resolve. He looked into the camera and spoke with the calm of a man who doesn't need to shout to be heard. "If the world won't give us wings," he said, "then we will build our own sky." That single sentence broke the silence. Radios repeated it. Children memorized it. In marketplaces, mothers stopped selling for a moment and listened. In army barracks, young soldiers lifted their eyes from the ground. And in churches across the country, priests repeated the line during prayer, not as politics but as faith. For the first time in a long time, the people of Burkina Faso looked up with hope instead of fear. Many around the world laughed. A country without a coast, without aircraft, without investors, dreaming of owning the sky? But Traoré didn't see limitation. He saw destiny. He knew that every border drawn on Africa's land had once been drawn on a map. And maps, like fate, can be redrawn. So he spoke again, not to governments, but to hearts. "We've flown with borrowed wings for too long," he said. "It's time to rise with our own. If you've ever felt the world close its doors on you, stay with this story. Because what happened next will change the way you see courage, faith, and the sky itself." 3 days after the silence began, the reason behind it finally emerged. The airspace of Burkina Faso had not been closed out of fear. It had been closed to mark a beginning. President Ibrahim Traoré revealed what many thought was impossible. The nation would build Africa's largest airport, 40 square kilometers of runway, terminals and solar fields, entirely without foreign loans. To the outside world, it sounded like fantasy. To his people, it sounded like freedom. At sunrise, the first trucks began to appear on the desert horizon. Some carried steel, others cement, and others simply carried people. Men and women who had never worked on a construction site, but who felt drawn to something greater than themselves. Farmers left their fields. Mechanics abandoned their small garages. Students traded notebooks for shovels. Soldiers put down their rifles and picked up sandbags. There were no contracts, no payrolls, only a sense of purpose. When a journalist asked an elderly man why he had come, he smiled with tired eyes and said, "I want to see Africa fly before I die." Those words spread like wildfire across the country. Local radio stations replayed them. Churches turned them into hymns. For the first time in generations, the people were not waiting for aid. They were building with their own hands. Within a week, the sound of engines returned to Ouagadougou. Not from aircraft, but from bulldozers and cement mixers. From above, the desert looked alive again. Rows of people moved like waves of ants across the sand, digging, welding, singing. A reporter from African News described it simply. "They're not building an airport, they're building dignity." The statement captured what statistics could not. This was not a project of money. It was a project of meaning. Each load of concrete was an act of defiance. Each wall that rose from the sand was a prayer in motion. At night, the work did not stop. Under floodlights powered by makeshift solar panels, crews kept building. Women in helmets directed cranes. Young soldiers welded steel frames. Sparks flying like shooting stars. The desert air carried songs, old tribal rhythms mixed with modern chants of unity. In one of those nights, a student carved 3 words into wet concrete. "We become free." By morning, those words were everywhere. Painted on trucks, scratched into helmets, whispered in homes. The Western media mocked them. In Brussels, commentators called the project a political show. In Paris, they named it the Sahel illusion. And in Washington, analysts released a report titled Burkina Faso's Flight to Nowhere. But inside the country, nobody cared. The people were too busy working. At a small village near the construction site, a group of women organized a community kitchen to feed the workers. They cooked millet and shared tea under makeshift tents. A local pastor blessed the food each morning, repeating the same words. Lord, bless the hands that build the sky. Traoré himself visited the site often, arriving without guards, his boots covered in dust. He didn't speak from a podium. He spoke from the ground, to the people. We are not building this for pride, he said softly. We are building faith. One soldier, exhausted but smiling, replied, Then faith has muscles, sir. The president laughed, and the workers joined him. For a brief moment, the desert felt like home. As the sun set, lights from the construction site glowed across the dunes, small dots of brightness in an ocean of darkness. From a satellite's view, the Sahel shimmered like a constellation reborn. It wasn't just an airport anymore. It was a symbol. A new kind of flag planted not in victory, but in perseverance. And yet, as hope spread across Burkina Faso, in the distant offices of the West, unease began to grow. Because what was being built in the desert wasn't just concrete and steel. It was something far more dangerous to the old order. An idea. But ideas, when they threaten power, never fly unchallenged. And soon the world would strike back. The news reached Western capitals faster than the dust could settle. Satellite images confirmed the impossible. Construction was moving forward, fast. Concrete runways stretched across 40 kilometers of the Sahel. Workers slept beside their machines. Volunteers arrived daily. In Brussels, the tone changed from amusement to alarm. In Paris, a defense analyst muttered on live television, "This isn't development, this is defiance." And in Washington, a confidential report was leaked. If Burkina Faso completes this project, it will reshape power dynamics in West Africa, and our influence will vanish. The response was swift. Bank transfers were blocked. Contracts were frozen. Foreign suppliers pulled out, citing security concerns. Burkina Faso was suddenly cut off. No fuel, no spare parts, no credit. But it was not out of hope. In the desert workshops, mechanics began forging what they couldn't import. Old military metal became support beams. Rusted truck engines were reassembled into cement mixers. When the world shut its doors, the people built their own. A young engineer told a local journalist, "They think sanctions will stop us. But necessity is our teacher. When the world denies you a path, the desert becomes your school." At night, when the power grid failed, the workers lit fires and kept working by torchlight. The smell of metal, sweat, and prayer filled the air. And then something extraordinary happened. Traoré gathered his advisors and gave an order that would echo across the continent. Connect the solar panels meant for the airport to the villages nearby. If we cannot fly yet, at least let our people see the light. That same night, the Sahel glowed. Thousands of homes, once dark, were illuminated by electricity drawn from the very project the world tried to stop. An African radio host in Bamako said it best. "They aren't building an airport anymore. They are building dignity under sanctions." The images spread like wildfire. Children doing homework beneath solar lamps. Women cooking with light for the first time. Villagers praying beside glowing rooftops. The symbolism was undeniable. Where others built airports to connect to the world, Burkina Faso had built one to connect to itself. Western governments responded with more pressure. Their officials asked, "Who funds this? China? Russia?" Traoré's answer was quiet but sharp. "They don't fear Russia or China. They fear Africa when it walks alone." That single line ignited the continent. University walls in Nairobi bore it in graffiti. Preachers in Ghana recited it in sermons. Musicians in Dakar turned it into song. And across African churches, another phrase was added: God bless those who do not kneel. Meanwhile, hackers launched cyber attacks on Burkina Faso's networks. Communication systems went down. Digital blueprints vanished overnight. But the engineers did not give up. They went back to paper, pencils, and a memory. They pinned hand-drawn plans to wooden boards, scrolled with the words, "If the sky denies us wings, the earth will teach us to fly." That phrase became the new anthem of the workers. Then came the storm. A real one. A massive sandstorm swept across the Sahel, burying the camp in darkness. Visibility dropped to nothing. Machines froze mid-motion. Amid the roaring wind, an old imam began to pray out loud. Soon, hundreds of workers knelt beside him, hands in the dust, eyes closed, voices trembling. When the storm finally passed, they rose. Not because someone commanded them, but because they felt history watching. A journalist from African News, her voice breaking, described what she saw. The West sanctioned them, but the sanctions became their cement. From that day forward, the work accelerated. No foreign aid, no imported machines, just ingenuity, faith, and unity. If you've ever doubted that faith could move mountains, look at what's happening here, where punishment became purpose and hardship became holy ground. By the time the world looked again, the impossible was already real. Steel towers stood in the desert. Solar fields glistened like oceans of light. The airport was alive, not as a structure, but as a spirit. But as the runways neared completion, one question began to haunt every capital in the West. What happens when a nation they once controlled learns how to fly without permission? As the sanctions tightened, something unexpected began to happen. The harder the world tried to choke Burkina Faso, the more alive it became. Villages that once waited for foreign aid were now sending caravans of volunteers to the construction site. Families donated food, water, even tools. Truck drivers painted messages on their vehicles. "We don't ask for permission. We build our future." From above, the desert looked like an anthill of hope. Thousands of people moving with one heartbeat. The social fabric of the country began to change. For decades, Burkina Faso had been divided by class, language, and religion. But now, under the heat of the Sahel sun, Christians and Muslims prayed side by side before picking up their tools. The airport was no longer a place of labor. It had become a cathedral of purpose. One local priest described it beautifully. When a people work together for faith, even the dust becomes sacred. And he wasn't wrong. In the early mornings, when the muezzin's call met the church bells, the sound rolled across the dunes like a hymn of unity. Soldiers shared water with students. Engineers slept beside farmers. Women with yellow helmets directed cement mixers, their faces glowing in the first light of dawn. A sense of pride spread through the nation. Radio hosts spoke of a moral revolution, one built not on politics, but on prayer and perseverance. The government began using local resources to replace what sanctions had taken. Roca volcanica from the north was mixed into the concrete to resist the desert's heat. Recycled metal became the frames for the control towers. And through it all, Traoré walked among his people. Not as a distant leader, but as a man of the soil. His boots were always dusty, his voice always calm. He rarely gave orders. He asked questions instead. How can we make this stronger? In a rare interview, when asked if he feared the West's retaliation, he smiled faintly and replied, "You can't fear losing what was never yours to begin with." That quote echoed far beyond Africa. In Washington, analysts debated it late into the night. Some called Traoré reckless, others called him revolutionary. Behind closed doors, intelligence memos began to circulate. They warned that the success of Burkina Faso's independent model could inspire a wave of economic nationalism across Africa. For the first time in years, the United States, a nation built on self-reliance and faith, saw its own reflection in the Sahel. It was a quiet irony that many older Americans understood. The values they cherished, work, unity, God, and grit, were now being practiced by a land they had long underestimated. Meanwhile, in Africa, hope was contagious. In Ghana, students started programs called Build Without Borrowing. In Senegal, churches organized prayer nights for Burkina's workers. Even in Kenya, a young boy wrote on his school wall, "One day, we'll build our own sky too." The political map of Africa was shifting, not through coups or revolts, but through belief. Yet belief can also be dangerous to those who profit from dependence. So the pressure grew. New trade restrictions appeared. Foreign media began spreading rumors, Chinese money, Russian weapons, secret deals. But the people of Burkina Faso didn't listen. They had learned something more powerful than propaganda. They had learned ownership. A woman at the construction camp said it best. "They can sanction our banks, but they can't sanction our hands." As weeks turned into months, the impossible started to look inevitable. Runways stretched across the horizon. Towers gleamed under the blazing sun. Children came after school to help carry stones. Old men sat by the side, murmuring prayers for those who would one day board the first plane. Even foreign journalists who came to discredit the project found themselves moved. A French reporter wrote later in disbelief, "I've worked on 3 continents. Never have I seen a people sing while lifting steel." If you ever wondered what freedom looks like, it's not found in speeches or flags. Sometimes it looks like dusty hands, tired faces, and a nation that refuses to stop. By now, the world understood this wasn't just about an airport. It was a war between 2 visions, one of control and one of sovereignty. And though the sanctions had slowed the machines, they had awakened something that no foreign power could contain, a people no longer afraid to dream. But in the halls of the West, another question began to rise. If one small nation can build its own sky, what happens when the rest of Africa learns to fly? From the deserts of West Africa to the conference rooms of Washington, a quiet unease began to spread. At first, analysts dismissed it as a regional oddity. But when satellite images confirmed that the airport was more than 60% complete, built without loans, without Western contractors, without permission, the laughter stopped. Reports circulated through defense departments and financial institutions. Burkina Faso, once one of the poorest nations in the world, had done what even wealthy countries struggle to do: mobilize faith into function. It was not just a project, it was proof that a nation could build power without debt, dignity without approval, and order without fear. In Brussels, diplomats argued whether to confront or contain. In Paris, pundits called it an African rebellion, disguised as infrastructure. But in Washington, the tone was different. Behind closed doors, a briefing reached the National Security Council. The first line read, "If Burkina Faso succeeds, the Western financial model in Africa collapses." It wasn't the airport that threatened them. It was the president. Because if one country could rise without loans, others might follow, and the old chains of dependency would start to break. A retired US general, interviewed anonymously, said something striking. "You can't bomb an idea. You can't sanction faith." He wasn't defending Traoré. He was recognizing a shift, a moral force that couldn't be measured in GDP or weapons. Meanwhile, African nations began to talk, quietly, carefully, about forming industrial alliances free from international lenders. For the first time in modern history, the continent was looking inward for strength, not outward for approval. American media tried to simplify the story, calling Traoré the populist of the Sahel, the dreamer with no runway. But those who watched closer saw something else. A nation becoming a mirror, reflecting back to the West the very values it once preached: faith, work, independence, and God-given dignity. And yet, as the towers of the new airport rose under the Sahel sun, a question echoed from Washington to the Vatican. What happens when faith itself becomes a geopolitical power? At dawn, the desert was still. No wind, no sound, just a pale gold light spilling across the dunes, touching the steel of a new creation. Men, women, and children gathered around the runway. Thousands of them, standing shoulder to shoulder. Soldiers with dusty uniforms. Mothers holding their children high so they could see. Old men leaning on sticks, whispering prayers. Then, it came. A metallic roar rising from the horizon. The sound grew, trembling through the sand until a silver glimmer appeared in the sky. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. And then, it lifted. The first aircraft ever built on African soil, by African hands, rising over African land. The crowd erupted. Some screamed, some cried, some fell to their knees. The pilot's voice, shaky with emotion, echoed through the radio. Burkina Faso is in the air. Across the continent, churches rang their bells. Mosques filled with chants. Radios replayed the words again and again. For the first time in generations, Africa was not looking up in envy. It was looking up in pride. Traoré walked slowly along the runway, the dust rising around his boots. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply looked toward the sky and said softly, "We did not build this for pride. We built it so that no African child will ever beg for wings again." The sentence hung in the air like a prayer. And in that silence, something sacred happened. The idea that had started as a dream had become a covenant, not between a leader and his people, but between man and destiny itself. When the plane disappeared into the clouds, no one moved, because everyone knew they had just witnessed something that could never be undone. Africa had touched the sky, and the world would never look at it the same way again. If this story reached your heart, don't just admire it, remember it. Because the freedom you just heard about was not built with permission, but with purpose. It was built by hands that refused to kneel, by hearts that believed God gives wings only to those brave enough to fly. May He bless those who dream beyond their limits. May He bless Africa, a land that rose from the dust to teach the world how to believe again. And may He bless every listener who still dares to look up and whisper, "Lord, let me build my own sky."